Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Breaking Through Your Data Bottleneck with Agile ETL. My name is Rory Carvalho and I am the Marketing Coordinator at LavaStorm. I have with me today Mark Marinelli, Chief Technical Officer at LavaStorm. Before we get started, just note that we will be recording this webinar and we'll be sending you a link to the recording. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mark.
Hello everyone, I just want to make sure I'm actually presenting before we get started. This is Mark Marinelli. I'm Chief Technology Officer here at LavaStorm, and I'm going to spend the next half an hour or so talking about Agile ETL as a mechanism to break through your data bottleneck. Let me just launch our, we're in there, we're good. Okay, so thanks for joining. Let me start, just frame this with an analogy I think that everybody can relate to. Sort of saying that everyone on this call and in any business wants to leverage their data for competitive advantage. We're sure that by performing more rigorous analysis of more data in our business, we'll get better insights, actionable insights, and be able to drive our business forward. The problem is that there's a lot of data, not a lot of people, and it can be very cumbersome and expensive for us to stand up the infrastructure and projects that we need to action some of what we know will be beneficial analytical projects. So the analogy here is everybody going to work and a toll booth. There's a manual process there, and it presents a log jam to all of the people that just want to get to work. They've got to pay their toll, and that can slow things down and sort of drip feed out to actually going to work and being productive. What we like to see in a situation like this, and we do see in certain areas, is the speed pass. I mean, if everything were a speed pass and everybody had one and they could just pass right through the toll booth without stopping, slowing down, we'd have that sort of free flow, everybody could get to work. That's really what we'd like to talk about here is a similar bottleneck, that the way that we have traditionally organized ourselves as businesses and the way we've tooled ourselves as businesses presents a similar bottleneck for people who just want to get at their data and derive more insight from their business. So before we get into the actual ETL bottleneck part, I'm going to talk an awful lot about Agile. And so I just want to set the table with what we mean by Agile. You'll hear this used a lot, capital A, small a lot of different flavors of Agile and tendencies of Agile and levels of maturity of Agile. At a high level, what I really want to talk about is when we're trying to solve a problem in our business and we're standing up a project, and we want to get to some target. If you think in terms of the time that it takes to get there and the remaining work to get to that goal, a traditional waterfall type, sort of the way that most projects have been done outside of an Agile framework, you have to gather some requirements. You have to figure out what you're actually trying to build. In terms of BI and data gathering and everything like that. Then you've got to develop it. This is oftentimes performed by technical resources in IT in concert with some business resources out in the line of business. Then you do a bunch of testing to make sure you got it right, and at the end you deliver it, and it sort of happens. And when that delivery occurs, when those first outcomes of whatever you've built start coming out, those first results, that's when you start seeing value from it. And only then do you start really seeing business value, which was what you were trying to accomplish in the first place. The problem with this is that it's only at this point when you often start to be able to ask some of the questions, because now you've seen the outcome, you're just going to start asking a whole bunch of follow-up questions because maybe you didn't encounter or didn't incorporate some of the results or the requirements, for the project because you just didn't know they existed until you saw the first outcome. In worst case, you got it wrong or you got parts of it wrong, and you really weren't able to check that until you started seeing results. This is a very protracted process. It can be a very expensive process, but it's just sort of the way that people have traditionally thought about solving problems. And then when we take our learnings from our first iteration of this, to go back and retrofit all of the work that we've done up until now can be very difficult because we've hardened these applications, and we've built them in a way that isn't particularly flexible and responsive to the changes that we understand at the end of the process. So Agile really is essentially breaking the problem down into smaller parts, and at each stage, asking some questions, and very importantly, getting some value. Or rather than trying to boil the ocean, as people would say, we're going to take the smallest part of that project that we can get our arms around. So the smallest set of data, the smallest set of questions from that data, and start working with the data. And we're going to find out something interesting. We're going to find out something interesting that makes us want to ask more questions. But we're also going to find out something interesting, optimally, that is actionable in of itself. Most of these stages, breaking this down, is going to help us increment toward our goal. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes we're going to hit a roadblock and realize that, well, we got the wrong data, or we're asking this question the wrong way. We need to bring some other people into this conversation so that we can ask it a better way. We need to bring some more data in. No value came out of this step except some learning. And then on to the next step, ask more questions, get more value. In the end, we're going to get there faster, better, cheaper, because we've started small and we've incremented. We've broken down the problem into a smaller problem, and we're going to increment on top of that rather than taking on the whole thing at once. We're going to get that continuous value delivery as each interim step gives us something that we can work on. We're going to get that continuous validation to make sure that we course correct. Every assumption that we make as we're building towards the larger understanding needs to be validated. It needs to be validated by contact with the actual business users who are going to apply this knowledge, the customers who may be on the business end of what we're going to do with that knowledge. We need to validate and course correct. And at the end, we need to not end up in a state where we don't have a lineage of independent steps, because then we won't be able to adapt going forward to change. This process never stops. Projects may end, but processes like this never do. As soon as we get to my target here, we're going to want to solve the next problem, or different aspects of this problem, or the business context or the data are going to change, and we need to retrofit some of how we got there. We need to continue to be agile. So that's a somewhat quick overview of what we mean by agile framework. Now we'll talk about how this has been applied to business. Good news is that in the data visualization part of the whole analytics supply chain, there's been a ton of movement as brought on by tools like Tableau or Click, Spotfire, some of these end-user visualization tools that a user, given access to data of small complexity, but given access to some spreadsheets, a couple of databases, they can bash that data together, and they can iterate on that all they want. They can continually, through a process of data discovery, ask a bunch of questions, get a bunch of answers, visualize this, and be really, really iterative and incremental in their understanding, as opposed to a traditional business intelligence, very heavy-weighted infrastructure in the past, where the latency between someone wanting to just ask a question of their data and visualize it and share it with others, and the actual ability for them to get the data, build the report, and everything to do that, that was a really long-term, or longer than people wanted it to be. Not minutes or hours, but days or weeks. This has been great, and that has led to broad adoption of the sort of precepts of this Agile approach up in the visualization layer, where people want to build reports and share things. That's great. The problem occurs when, on the other side of that sort of curated set of data, is the morass of data that are big data platforms, legacy platforms in the business, complex databases, the whole menagerie that everyone has in any enterprise environment of different data sources that were built by different people that have different interfaces, different ways to get data out. All of that is really, really complicated and, at least at present, beyond the reach of those users who have been working in that agile fashion with the tools that they've got. It's not a knock on the people or the tools. It's just really, really hard to get all of these data together and for IT to curate these data sets and get them out to the end users. So this presents a really big bottleneck. When you realize that everything that you've been doing with the data would be a lot more interesting if you could get your hands on that legacy billing system and order management system that you've never really been able to see in its fullness, you've got to talk to someone in IT who's going to understand those systems and be able to build the necessary infrastructure to service that data request. These are very busy people. They've got a lot going on. And so you end up in this bottleneck where your ability to increment is stymied by being behind a whole bunch of other data requests in a queue. Why is this the case? Why isn't their ability to gather all of these data and provide them to the line of business user as easy as the line of business user's ability to ask a bunch of questions of this simple data set? It's really tradition. There was a time when, in order to ask a question from your data and then provide a valuable answer, it was really hard because for sort of legacy reasons of processing and hardware and software, there was a lot that needed to be done to gather those data from the different data sets in order to prepare the data, to perform some analysis, and to put it out for visualization. Traditionally, the enterprise data warehouse was the mechanism by which all of these different systems would be sort of rationalized and a governance layer would be imposed to make sure that as we were gathering the data and presenting them in some sort of useful amalgamated format, that we were making sure that only the right people who were eventually going to interact with these data were going to do that. So there's got to be some governance. We have protected data and things that we needed to, IT really needed to keep control over. Then a data warehouse doesn't get you very far if you're a business user, so there's a necessary, essential technique of data curation, I'll call it, which is taking those data that can be sort of arcane and complex and presenting them in, I've got a cube here because it used to be the BI cube, you'd be familiar with that, but presenting them in a way that made them analytically useful, to dimensionalize the data, to translate the 5 different tables that all have customer ID in different formats into a single customer ID, all of that stuff which is necessary to get stuff out to the visualization layer. And then there's a whole automation scheme. Most of the stuff that's worth doing is going to be worth doing more than once. So you need to have some way to mechanize this, to publish the reports every hour, every day, to have some data gathering frequency that makes sense. All of this stuff was and is absolutely necessary. It's just that our tooling was built long before the sort of modern era of self-service, when computing power is available to individuals on their laptops that used to only be available inside an IT data warehouse or data infrastructure. We haven't really adapted, to a large degree, the tool set, ergo we haven't really adapted our mindset. So it's nobody's fault, it's just sort of inertial. Ultimately, this comes down to a very simple equation that you can be as agile as you want out in the business intelligence and visualization layer, but if you're working with a waterfall ETL project and all that supply chain that I just talked about, and the long cycle of being able to present your next or richer set of data. Essentially, it's the lowest common denominator here, and you're doing waterfall analytics. That there's going to be a very long period of data assembly before you can start asking questions of the data. And when you start asking questions from the data, which present other questions that or more data that you'd want, you're back in that big long waterfall cycle. And that's not where we want to be. We want our entire analytical process to be as agile as currently our visualization process is. So why is this the case? I mean, why? It's not just the inertia and the technology piece. There's some resistance to adapting the sort of agile precepts in a traditional technology and traditional process stack because we still really need to do the things that I showed on the previous slide. We need to govern the data, we need to curate the data, and we need to automate it. Those requirements are with us. We have ways to solve that. In the traditional ETL and sort of data management space, in order for us to control access to the data, as I said before, we build a data warehouse. In order for us to ensure data integrity, which is essential, we want to make sure that people are asking good questions of good data rather than asking good questions of bad data. We do things like build data dictionaries, which sort of allow everybody to understand what this field means and how it should be used and what it should look like. Those are they're sort of accomplishing the task, but they're very restrictive. You have to have sort of an a priori knowledge of every question that everybody's going to ask of every data element, and then institutionalize this in somewhat rigid infrastructure before people can start asking questions of the data. And that's very restrictive. On the curation side, you got to make the data user-friendly, so you have to apply, we typically call it a semantic layer, that translation between something that seems mathematical or arcane down in the data layer into something that's human understandable, that's a customer ID, that's an address, and translating that so that it can be useful for a business user. Got to do that. Got to ensure once these business users are starting to build analytical techniques, build reports on top of this stuff, we don't want 10 different people asking the same question 10 different ways. So we want to